Ex-soldier saved his neighbor from a fire, later discovering the man he rescued was the brother he never met. The words had echoed in James Mitchell's mind every day since that night, like a headline from a life that couldn't possibly be his own. Yet here he was, 3 months later, staring at the same ceiling crack that had become his reluctant companion during sleepless nights. Dawn crept through his blinds, painting thin golden stripes across his Spartan bedroom. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. James had grown accustomed to silence after 15 years in the army. What he hadn't grown accustomed to was the emptiness. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, wincing as his right knee protested. The shrapnel wounds had healed years ago, but weather changes still sent lightning bolts of pain through the joint. Another souvenir from Afghanistan. Another reminder. The morning routine was mechanical. Coffee brewing, toast burning slightly because he always set the timer too long, a quick shower where he avoided looking at the web of scars across his torso. 40 minutes later, he was dressed in his maintenance uniform, keys in hand, ready for another day of fixing other people's problems while ignoring his own. Outside, autumn had painted the neighborhood in rust and gold. 3 months ago, summer had still been clinging to the city, the night air thick and oppressive when the fire had erupted across the hall. James closed his eyes briefly, the memory flashing, hot and immediate. The alarm blaring at 2:17 a.m., the acrid smell seeping under his door. Training kicking in before conscious thought could form. The hallway filled with churning smoke, and apartment 4B's door hot to the touch. James had kicked it open without hesitation. Inside was hell. Dancing orange flames climbing the curtains, black smoke rolling along the ceiling, and the unconscious form of the man he'd nodded to in passing for 8 months, but never actually spoken to. What was his name? Martin? Marcus? Matthew? James whispered now, stepping into the crisp morning air. Matthew Collins, the neighbor who had become so much more. The community center buzzed with the quiet energy of the Tuesday morning veterans support group. James sat in his usual spot, third chair from the door, back to the wall. Old habits. Would you like to share today, James? Doctor. Leanne Powell's voice was gentle but persistent. She'd been trying to get him to open up for weeks. The circle of men and women, some older Vietnam vets, several from his own generation of Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, watched him with understanding eyes. They'd all been through their own versions of hell. They all carried their own scars, visible and invisible. James cleared his throat. 3 months ago, I pulled my neighbor from a fire. The words felt inadequate, like describing a hurricane as a bit of wind. But it was a start, and Dr. Powell's encouraging nod prompted him to continue. I didn't think much about it at the time. Training kicked in. I just did what needed doing. He rubbed his palms against his work pants. But after, when he was recovering in the hospital, things got complicated. Complicated. What an absurd understatement. He had no family listed as emergency contacts. No visitors. I checked on him because... James paused, searching for the reason. Because nobody should wake up alone after something like that. What he didn't say was how familiar that loneliness had looked on Matthew's smoke-smudged face. How he'd recognized it like looking in a mirror. We started talking. Really talking. Found out we both grew up in foster care. Both bounced around the system in the same county. James swallowed hard. He showed me a photo he kept. The only thing he had from his birth family. A woman holding a baby. The room had gone completely still. Dr. Powell leaned forward slightly. It was my mother. James said, the words barely audible. I have the same photo. A collective intake of breath rippled through the circle. DNA test confirmed it 3 weeks ago. He's my younger brother. Born after I was already in the system. Neither of us knew the other existed. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Walter, a Vietnam vet with a silver beard and gentle eyes, simply asked, "How are you handling that, son?" James looked down at his hands. How was he handling it? The question had been churning inside him since the day the test results had arrived. I touch him. I don't know, he admitted. I've been alone my whole life, self-sufficient. Now suddenly I have famari, our family. The word felt foreign on his tongue. And not just any family. Someone I saved without knowing who he was. It feels like the universe playing some cosmic joke, offered Elena, a former Navy medic. Or giving you a second chance, said Walter quietly. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. A second chance at what, though? He'd never known how to be a brother, had never experienced family beyond the brotherhood of soldiers. And Matthew, recovering from smoke inhalation and second-degree burns, seemed equally lost. "We're having dinner tonight," James finally said. First time since he got out of the hospital last week. Dr. Powell smiled. "That's a positive step, James. Remember what we've discussed about connections being the foundation of healing?" "Yeah." James checked his watch. "I should get to work." As he stood to leave, Walter caught his arm. "Son, some of us spend our whole lives looking for what just fell into your lap. Don't run from it." James nodded stiffly, but as he walked out into the autumn morning, Walter's words followed him. Don't run from it. But running was what James had always done best, whether toward danger in combat or away from emotional entanglements in civilian life. Tonight would be different. It had to be. The maintenance requests kept James busy all day. Mrs. Peterson's leaky faucet on the first floor, the Ramirez family's stuck window on 2, a faulty light fixture in the third-floor hallway. Routine problems with straightforward solutions, unlike the situation waiting for him that evening. At 6 o'clock, he found himself standing outside apartment, a new building across town. 4B had been destroyed in the fire, and the property management company had relocated Matthew to another of their buildings during reconstruction. James held a bottle of wine awkwardly in one hand. Was that appropriate? He had no idea what the protocol was for dinner with the brother you never knew existed until you pulled him from a burning building. He knocked before he could overthink it further. The door opened, and there stood Matthew Collins, 6 years younger than James's 38 years, with the same square jaw and dark hair, though Matthew's eyes were hazel rather than James's deep brown. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. "Hey," Matthew said, his voice still slightly raspy from the smoke damage. "Come in." The apartment was sparsely furnished. Most of Matthew's possessions had been lost in the fire, but clean and bright. A small table was set for 2, and the smell of pasta sauce filled the air. "I brought wine," James said, holding out the bottle. "I wasn't sure if you—" "Thanks." Matthew took it with a small smile. "I do drink. Moderately. Unlike our father, apparently." The casual reference to their shared biology hung in the air. Neither of them had known their father. He had abandoned their mother before James was born and had reportedly drunk himself to death years ago. "I made pasta," Matthew continued, moving toward the kitchenette. "Nothing fancy. I'm still learning to cook with one fully functional hand." He held up his right hand, still partially bandaged from the burns. "Can I help?" James asked, setting down his keys. "Almost done, actually. But you could pour the wine." They moved around each other carefully, like dancers unsure of the steps. James found glasses in the cabinet Matthew pointed to, and poured the deep red liquid while Matthew drained pasta at the sink. "So?" Matthew said as they finally sat across from each other, plates steaming between them. "This is weird, right?" "It's not just me." The blunt question startled a laugh out of James. "Definitely not just you." Matthew's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. Because I've been rehearsing normal dinner conversation all day, and everything I came up with sounded ridiculous." "How was your day, brother? I never knew I had until you carried me through flames." James felt something loosen in his chest. "Better than my version." "The weather's nice. By the way, thanks for sharing my DNA." They both laughed, a tentative sound that nonetheless filled the small apartment with unexpected warmth. "I'm sorry I didn't visit more at the hospital," James said, sobering. "After we found out, I needed time to process." Matthew twirled pasta around his fork. "I get it. I've had the same photo of our mother my whole life, and suddenly there you were, the baby in her arms. It's a lot. What did your foster parents tell you about your birth family?" James asked carefully. "Not much. That my mother died when I was an infant. Never mentioned a brother." Matthew took a sip of wine. You? Similar story. I was 3 when she died. Don't really remember her. Went straight into the system. No one ever said anything about another child. They ate in silence for a moment, the weight of lost years between them. "Do you remember anything?" "About her?" Matthew asked, his voice carefully neutral. James set down his fork, closing his eyes briefly. "A smell. Lavender, I think. And humming. She used to hum when she cooked." The memory was fragile, more impression than clear image. "And cold hands." Her hands were always cold. When he opened his eyes, Matthew was staring at him with an intensity that was almost physical. "That's more than I ever had," Matthew said quietly. The simple statement hit James with unexpected force. Here was someone who shared his blood, who had lost the same mother, who had navigated the same broken system, and yet their experiences were entirely their own. Separate, Parallel lines that should have intersected but never did, until a fire forced their paths to cross. "Tell me about the army," Matthew said, clearly changing the subject. 15 years, right? That's what the nurse said when you first visited. James nodded, grateful for the shift. Joined at 18. Only place that ever felt like home. Until IED in Kandahar province. 3 years ago, James unconsciously rubbed his knee. Medical discharge. Matthew studied him. And then what? Straight to apartment maintenance? Not exactly. There were some rough patches. James didn't elaborate on the months of physical therapy, the drinking, the nights when the only thing that kept him from eating his service pistol was the thought of some other soldier having to clean up the mess. The property management company has a veteran hiring program. It's quiet work. Predictable. Safe. Matthew supplied. James looked up sharply. "Sorry," Matthew backpedaled. "I didn't mean..." "No, you're right." James surprised himself with the admission. "After what I saw over there, safe seemed necessary. Until you ran into a burning building," Matthew pointed out. "That was different." "How?" James considered the question. "Training takes over. You don't think, you just move. And save lives," Matthew added quietly. "Mine specifically." The air between them changed, charged with unspoken emotion. "I would have done it for anyone," James said. "I know. That's who you are." Matthew pushed his plate away slightly. "But it wasn't anyone. It was me, your brother." He shook his head in disbelief. "Out of all the buildings in this city, we ended up living across the hall from each other. What are the odds?" "Astronomical," James agreed. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "About what?" Matthew's eyes, so different in color from James's but similar in shape, held a challenge. "About whether some things are meant to happen. Destined." James had seen too much random violence, too much senseless death to believe in destiny. "I think it was coincidence. Lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it." "And how do you look at it?" Matthew's question was direct, uncompromising. James took a long sip of wine, buying time. The truth was, he didn't know. Finding a brother at 38 had upended everything he thought he knew about himself, about his place in the world. It had cracked open the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his life. "I'm still figuring that out," he finally said. Matthew nodded, accepting the non-answer. "Me too." He stood collecting their plates. "Coffee?" "Sure." As Matthew busied himself with the coffee maker, James noticed a small box on the counter, labeled in a neat hand. "Photos saved from fire. May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Matthew glanced over. "Go ahead." Not much survived, but a few things did. James opened the box carefully. Inside were perhaps a dozen photographs, edges curled and brown from heat. He lifted them gently. Matthew at various ages. Graduation, at a beach, sitting on what looked like a dorm room bed. And then at the bottom of the stack, the photo that had changed everything. Their mother, young and tired-looking, but smiling, holding an infant James. "She was beautiful," Matthew said, setting a mug of coffee beside James. "Yes." James couldn't take his eyes off the image. "I've never seen this particular shot. In mine, she's looking at the camera. In this one, she's looking at you," Matthew finished. "I used to wonder who the baby was. My caseworker didn't know or wouldn't tell me. Just said it was the only photo they had when I entered the system." James carefully set the photo down. "We were separated when I was 3 and you were..." "What? A few months old?" Matthew nodded. "After she died. Heart condition, apparently. No other family to take us? None that wanted us, it seems." The blunt assessment hung between them. Two unwanted boys, split apart by an indifferent system, now reunited by chance or fate or whatever name you gave to the invisible forces that shaped lives. "I would have looked for you," James said suddenly, the words escaping before he could consider them. "If I'd known, I would have found you." Something flashed across Matthew's face. Pain or hope or some complex mixture of both. "I believe you." The simple affirmation lodged in James's chest, a physical pressure behind his sternum. They drank their coffee in a silence that had shifted from awkward to something more contemplative, more companionable. "I should probably go," James said eventually, glancing at his watch. "Early shift tomorrow." "Right." Matthew walked him to the door. "Thanks for coming. And for the wine." James paused in the doorway, suddenly reluctant to leave. "We should do this again." "Definitely." Matthew's smile was cautious but genuine. "Maybe next time you can cook." "Fair warning, my culinary skills begin and end with burnt toast." "I'll take my chances." They stood for a moment, neither quite sure how to end the evening. A handshake seemed too formal, a hug too presumptuous. Finally, James simply nodded. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, James." A pause. "Be safe going home." The words, so ordinary, so familial, followed James down the hallway, out into the cool night air, and all the way back to his empty apartment. Be safe going home. For the first time in years, James wondered if perhaps he already had. The next few weeks fell into an unexpected pattern. Twice weekly dinners, alternating between their apartments. Text messages about small, inconsequential things. A good coffee shop, Matthew discovered. A ridiculous request from one of James's tenants. The changing fall colors in the park between their buildings. Slowly, cautiously, they began constructing a relationship neither had been prepared for. "Did you always want to be a graphic designer?" James asked one evening as he watched Matthew work on a client project, his bandaged hand now healed enough to navigate the computer with careful precision. Matthew's fingers paused over the keyboard. "Not always. I wanted to be a firefighter when I was a kid." James raised an eyebrow. "Ironic." "Yeah." Matthew laughed softly. Life has a twisted sense of humor. He saved his work and turned to face James. "What about you? Was the Army always the plan?" "It was the only plan that made sense at 18. No money for college, no real direction." James shrugged. The recruiter promised structure, purpose, brotherhood. Did it deliver? 2 out of 3. At Matthew's questioning look, he elaborated. Structure and purpose in spades. Brotherhood. It's complicated. You form bonds, intense ones. But then deployments end, people transfer, or he didn't finish the sentence. Or they don't come home, Matthew supplied quietly. James nodded once sharply. The hardest part of civilian life is the isolation. In the Army, you're never alone, even when you want to be. Out here, he gestured vaguely. It's all on you, Matthew finished. Exactly. Is that why you came to check on me in the hospital? Breaking the isolation? James considered the question. Partly, and partly because it was the right thing to do. No one should wake up in a hospital room alone. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. 3 different hospitals after the IED. Woke up alone in all of them. He cleared his throat. Most of my unit was already rotating home. The guys I was closest to, they didn't make it. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. That photo of our mother. It's the only thing I took when I ran away from my last foster home. The abrupt change of subject startled James. You ran away? Matthew nodded. I was 16. The Reynolds family. They were not good people. His expression darkened. I spent 6 months on the streets before a youth shelter helped me get my GED and eventually into community college. James felt a surge of protective rage for the 16-year-old version of his brother, alone and vulnerable. I'm sorry. I should have been there. You couldn't have known. Still, James's hands had curled into fists without his awareness. He consciously relaxed them. It's hard to accept that we were both struggling through life separately when we could have faced it together. Maybe that's why we found each other now. Matthew suggested, maybe we still need to face things together. The suggestion lingered between them, both a question and a possibility. Maybe, James agreed softly. That night, walking home under a sky scattered with stars, James found himself considering Matthew's words. What did they still need to face together? What purpose could this belated brotherhood serve in either of their lives? He had no answers, only the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface, reshaping the landscape of his life in ways he couldn't yet see or understand. You're different. Doctor, Powell observed at the next support group meeting. James shifted in his chair. Different how? More present, she said, less guarded. You've spoken up in every session for the past month. He hadn't realized it until she pointed it out, but she was right. He'd been sharing more, engaging with the other veterans' stories, even offering perspective when newer members struggled. It's the brother thing, Elena suggested with a knowing smile. Having family changes you. We're hardly family, James objected automatically. We've only known about each other for a couple of months. Walter's bushy eyebrows rose. Blood is blood, son. But it's more than that. You've got purpose again. I have a maintenance job, James countered. You have someone to care about. Walter corrected gently. Someone who counts on you showing up. Makes a difference. James wanted to argue but found he couldn't. The truth was, his days had taken on new meaning. He found himself looking forward to text messages from Matthew, planning what to cook for their next dinner, thinking about Christmas for the first time in years. "It's not just one-sided," he said instead. "Matthew checks on me too. Remembers things I mention. It's unfamiliar." Dr. Powell smiled. "That's how healthy relationships work, James. Mutual care and attention." The phrase healthy relationships made James uncomfortable. His experience with relationships of any kind was limited and largely unsuccessful. A few short-lived romantic connections that had fizzled when his PTSD symptoms became too challenging. Friendships that had drifted after his medical discharge. Even his military bonds had been forged in extraordinary circumstances that couldn't be replicated in civilian life. "I don't really know how to do this," he admitted. "Be a brother. None of us get instruction manuals for the important relationships in our lives." Dr. Powell said, "We learn by doing, by showing up, by being honest about our limitations, and by forgiving ourselves when we mess up," added Elena. James nodded, absorbing their words. After the meeting, Walter approached him, moving slowly with his cane. "Got a minute?" the older veteran asked. Of course. James fell into step beside him as they walked toward the community center exit. "I lost my brother in Vietnam," Walter said without preamble. "He was in a different unit, different part of the country. Didn't even know he was there until I got word he'd been killed." He paused at the door. "I've spent 50 years wondering what I would say to him if I had one more chance." James waited, sensing there was more. "Don't waste this gift you've been given," Walter continued. "Brothers are rare and precious things in this world, especially for men like us who've seen what we've seen." "I'm trying," James said honestly. Walter nodded. "I know you are, and that's a start." He pushed open the door. "But there's something holding you back." "I can see it." James stiffened. "What do you mean?" "You're still keeping parts of yourself locked away. The darkest parts." Walter's eyes, faded blue with age, were unnervingly perceptive. "The parts you think would drive him away if he knew." The observation hit too close to home. James looked away. "Trust goes both ways, son," Walter said gently. "If you want him to trust you with his pain, you have to trust him with yours." With that, the older man patted James's shoulder and made his way slowly down the community center steps, leaving James with an uncomfortable truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, bringing sharp lightning and rumbling thunder that rattled the windows of James's apartment. He sat rigid on his couch, television on but muted, trying to focus on anything but the crash of thunder that sent his mind spinning back to Afghanistan. His phone buzzed with a text from Matthew. "You okay with this storm? Heard thunder can be rough for some vets." The simple acknowledgement of his struggle, offered without judgment or pity, broke something open inside James. Before he could overthink it, he typed back, "Not great. Brings back some things I'd rather forget." 3 dots appeared immediately, then, "Want company?" James hesitated. His instinct was to decline, to handle it alone as he always had. But Walter's words echoed in his mind. "Trust goes both ways. If you don't mind the walk," he typed back, "be there in 15. True to his word, Matthew arrived 15 minutes later, slightly damp from the rain, carrying a paper bag. "Brought reinforcements," he said, pulling out a bottle of good bourbon and a bag of microwave popcorn. "Figured we could drown out the thunder with a movie. Something mindless with lots of explosions that have nothing to do with war." James felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. "Thanks," he managed. They settled on the couch with tumblers of bourbon and a bowl of popcorn between them. Matthew found an action movie on streaming. Cars racing, improbable stunts, no military themes, and turned the volume up just enough to mask the storm without being startling. During a particularly loud thunderclap, James flinched visibly. Matthew pretended not to notice, instead launching into a story about a disastrous client meeting he'd had that week. The distraction worked, pulling James's focus away from the storm and the memories it triggered. 2 hours and several generous pours of bourbon later, the storm had passed and the movie had ended. James felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Thanks," he said again, more steadily this time. "You didn't have to come over." Matthew shrugged. "What are brothers for?" The casual statement hit James with unexpected force. Brothers. They were brothers, not by choice or shared history or common experience, but by blood and now, increasingly, by choice. "I never had anyone who would do something like this," James admitted, the bourbon loosening his usual restraint. "Show up during a bad night." Matthew studied him for a moment. "Me neither." Foster families were complicated. Some tried, but there was always a distance. A reminder that you weren't really theirs. James nodded, understanding completely. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew ventured. When James nodded, he continued. "That night, the fire, how did you know I was still inside?" James took another sip of bourbon, remembering. "I didn't, not for certain, but your car was in its spot and it was late. I just felt it. You could have waited for the fire department." "No," James said simply. "I couldn't have." Matthew nodded slowly. "I was unconscious by the time you found me. Smoke inhalation. You were on the kitchen floor. The doctor said another few minutes and I would have had permanent lung damage. Maybe worse." James didn't respond. He remembered the weight of Matthew's unconscious body over his shoulder, the heat pressing in from all sides, the desperate sprint down the smoke-filled hallway. "You saved my life," Matthew said quietly. "Brother or not, I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything," James replied, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I do, but it's more than that." Matthew set his empty glass down. "Finding out we're brothers, it answered questions I've had my whole life. About belonging, about why I never quite fit anywhere." James understood that feeling all too well. "The army was the first place I ever felt like I belonged," he admitted. "And when that ended," he trailed off. "You've been searching ever since," Matthew finished. "Yeah." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic from the street below. "It's late," Matthew said eventually. "I should probably head home." "You could stay," James offered, surprising himself. "Couch pulls out. Storm might start up again." Matthew seemed to consider this. "You sure?" "Yeah. Got extra sheets and everything." It was a small thing, this offer of temporary shelter, but it felt significant somehow. A step towards something neither of them could quite name. "Okay," Matthew agreed. "Thanks." Later, after the couch had been transformed into a bed and Matthew had settled in, James paused in the doorway of his bedroom. "A good night," he said, his hand on the light switch. "Night," Matthew replied, then added softly, "Thanks for letting me stay, brother." The word hung in the darkness after James turned out the light, a bridge across the void that had separated them for 38 years. Saharan, morning brought weak sunshine and the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around his apartment. James lay still for a moment, listening to the domestic noises. Water running, cabinets opening and closing, the coffee maker gurgling to life. It had been years since anyone had stayed overnight in his space. The lack of privacy should have made him anxious, but instead he found himself relaxing into the sounds of Matthew's presence. When he finally emerged from his bedroom, he found Matthew at the stove, making scrambled eggs with the meager contents of James's refrigerator. "Hope this is okay," Matthew said, glancing over his shoulder. "Figured I'd make breakfast since you let me crash." "It's fine," James assured him, pouring himself a cup of the coffee Matthew had brewed. More than fine. They ate at the small kitchen table, morning light streaming through the window, casting long rectangles of brightness across the worn linoleum. "I've been thinking," Matthew said between bites, "we should try to find out more about our mother." James looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "There must be records somewhere. Maybe people who knew her. I never really looked before because," he shrugged, "it seemed pointless when I was alone. But now with both of us, it feels different." James set down his fork. The idea of digging into the past made him uneasy. He'd spent years carefully walling off his childhood, focusing instead on the present and immediate future. Survival mode. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Just think about it," Matthew suggested. "No pressure, but I'd like to know where we came from, who she really was." James nodded non-committally, but the idea had taken root, bringing with it a mixture of trepidation and reluctant curiosity. After Matthew left for a client meeting, James found himself standing before the small metal box he kept in his closet, his only repository of personal history. He hesitated, then pulled it down and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were his discharge papers, a few medals, the letter informing him of his mother's death that he'd received as an adult after requesting his foster care records, and at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the photograph of his mother holding him as an infant. He unwrapped it carefully, studying the image that matched the one Matthew had shown him, yet different in one crucial detail. In Matthew's photo, she was looking at baby James with unmistakable love. In this one, she was looking directly at the camera, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Who had taken these photos? Who had been behind the camera, capturing these moments of a young mother with her firstborn son? The questions Matthew had raised began to multiply in James's mind. What had happened to their mother? Why had no family members stepped forward to keep them together? Who was the father who had abandoned them before birth? For the first time in decades, James allowed himself to wonder about the circumstances that had shaped his earliest years. The ones that had set him on a path of isolation and self-reliance that had defined his entire life. He carefully rewrapped the photo and placed it back in the box. But the questions remained, circling in his thoughts throughout the day as he fixed a broken dishwasher and replaced light fixtures in the building's lobby. That evening, he called Matthew. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began without preamble, "about looking into our mother's history." And Matthew sounded cautiously hopeful. "Let's do it," James decided. "But I want to be clear. We might not like what we find." "I know," Matthew said quietly, "but not knowing is worse. At least for me." James understood that sentiment more than he cared to admit. "Okay then. Where do we start?" "I've already done some preliminary research," Matthew admitted. "There's a county records office where we can request her death certificate. That might give us more information. Cause of death, next of kin, maybe an address where she lived." James felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of official buildings and bureaucratic processes, but he pushed it aside. "When do you want to go? Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I have a meeting in the morning, but I'm clear after lunch." "I'll rearrange my maintenance schedule," James promised. After ending the call, he sat for a long time in the quiet of his apartment, wondering if he was making a mistake. The past had a way of unleashing unpredictable consequences. His military training had taught him to control variables whenever possible, to minimize risk. This felt like stepping into an open field without knowing where the mines were buried. But for the first time in years, the prospect of the unknown didn't fill him with dread. Instead, there was something else, a cautious curiosity, a tentative hope. The possibility that understanding where he came from might help him make sense of where he was going, and he wouldn't be facing it alone. The county records office was housed in a squat, brick government building that smelled of old paper and industrial cleaning products. James and Matthew sat side by side in molded plastic chairs, waiting for their number to be called. "You okay?" Matthew asked, noticing James's tense posture. "Fine," James replied automatically, then amended, "A bit on edge. I don't do well with bureaucracy." Matthew nodded, understanding. "Too many hoops to jump through for veterans' benefits?" "Something like that." Their number flashed on the electronic board, and they approached a counter where a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Gloria waited. "How can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she'd asked the same question hundreds of times that day. "We're looking for a death certificate," Matthew explained. "Sarah Mitchell. She died in this county in 1986. Gloria nodded and began typing on her computer. "Relation to the deceased?" "She was our mother," Matthew said. Gloria's fingers paused momentarily, her eyes flicking between them, noting the resemblance perhaps. "Both of you?" "Yes," James confirmed. "We're brothers." Something in his tone must have conveyed that the explanation was more complicated than they wanted to get into, because Gloria simply nodded and returned to her typing. "I'm showing a Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, died September 12, 1986. Is that correct?" "Yes," James said, a chill running through him at hearing the full date. He'd known the year but not the specific day. "I can print a copy of the death certificate for a $20 fee. Would you like the long form or short form?" "Long form, please," Matthew answered, already reaching for his wallet. Gloria nodded and hit a few more keys. "It'll just be a moment. The system needs to retrieve the scanned document." While they waited, James found himself studying the governmental office. The fluorescent lighting, the scuffed linoleum, the faded motivational posters on the walls. Places like this had featured prominently in his childhood. Social workers' offices, courthouse waiting rooms, administrative buildings where decisions about his life were made by people who barely knew him. "Here we go," Gloria said, a printer behind her whirring to life. She retrieved the document, placed it in an official envelope, and slid it across the counter. "That will be $20. Matthew paid, and they thanked her before moving to a small table in the corner of the waiting area to examine their find. James felt a strange reluctance as Matthew carefully opened the envelope and removed the certificate. This piece of paper represented the official end of a life he barely remembered. The moment when two brothers were set on separate paths that wouldn't converge again for over 3 decades. Matthew spread the document on the table between them. Name of deceased, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. Date of death, September 12, 1986. Age, 24 years. Cause of death, cardiac arrest due to postpartum cardiomyopathy. Place of death, County Hospital. Usual residence, 1423 Maple Street, Apt, 2B. Father of deceased, Robert Callahan. Mother of deceased, Elizabeth Callahan, née Porter. Informant, social services, no next of kin available. James stared at the clinical details of his mother's end. 24 years old. Just a girl, really. Younger than he'd been when he first deployed to Afghanistan. Postpartum cardiomyopathy. Matthew read quietly. That's a heart condition related to childbirth. Your birth, James realized. She died from complications after having you. The implication hung heavy between them. James saw Matthew's face pale slightly. It wasn't your fault, James said immediately, instinctively reaching out to grip his brother's shoulder. Medical condition. Nothing you could have controlled. Matthew nodded, but his expression remained troubled. I never knew the exact cause. Just that she died when I was an infant. James focused on the other details, trying to process the information. Look at this, her parents' names, our grandparents, and an address where she lived. The informant line, Matthew pointed out. Social services. No family stepped forward, which means our grandparents were either dead or… James didn't finish the thought. Or they didn't want us, Matthew completed softly. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the reality of what the document revealed and what it didn't. The address, James finally said. We could go there, see if anyone in the neighborhood remembers her. It's been over 30 years, Matthew cautioned. Still, someone might know something. And we have our grandparents' names now. We could try to track them down, or at least find out what happened to them. Matthew studied him with surprise. I thought you were reluctant about this whole investigation. James surprised himself with his answer. I was, but now, he tapped the death certificate. She was so young and alone. I want to understand why. Matthew nodded slowly. Me too. He carefully returned the certificate to its envelope. The address first? It's not far from here, actually. I looked it up when I saw it on the form. James checked his watch. We have time now if you want. Let's do it. They left the county building and got into Matthew's car, a practical sedan that still smelled new. As they drove through familiar streets that were taking on new significance, James found himself wondering about the young woman who had given birth to him, raised him for 3 years, then had another child only to die shortly after. What had her life been like? What dreams had she harbored? What circumstances had led her to be so alone with 2 small children? For the first time, he allowed himself to see her as a person separate from the vague concept of mother. Young, vulnerable, perhaps scared, but determined enough to keep her children when it would have been easier to give them up. Here we are, Matthew said, pulling up in front of a 3-story apartment building on Maple Street. 1423. The building was old but well-maintained, with a small courtyard out front and iron railings on the balconies. It looked like a decent place to live, neither luxurious nor desperately poor. Apartment 2B, James murmured. 2nd floor. They sat in the car for a moment, both hesitant to approach. This feels invasive somehow, Matthew admitted, like we're trespassing in her life. James understood the sentiment exactly. We can leave if you want. No, Matthew decided. We've come this far. They got out of the car and approached the building. The front door was locked, but as they stood considering their options, an elderly woman emerged, shopping bag in hand. Can I help you, boys? She asked, looking them over with the cautious assessment of someone who had lived in cities long enough to be wary of strangers. We're actually looking for information, Matthew explained, about someone who used to live here. A long time ago. The woman's wariness didn't diminish. What kind of information? James stepped forward. Our mother lived in apartment 2B in 1986. Sarah Mitchell. We're trying to learn more about her. The woman's expression changed, softening slightly. You're Sarah's boys? The question hit them both like a physical blow. You knew her? James asked, his voice rough with surprise. The woman nodded slowly. I've lived in 3A for 42 years. I remember Sarah. Sweet girl, very young to be on her own with a baby. She looked more closely at James. You must be the older one. She was so proud of you. James felt something constrict in his chest. A mixture of pain and longing so acute it momentarily robbed him of speech. I'm Mrs. Abernathy, the woman continued. Why don't you boys come up to my apartment? I might have some things you'd want to see. They followed her into the building and up a flight of stairs, exchanging stunned glances. Of all the scenarios they had imagined, running into someone who had actually known their mother hadn't seemed possible. Mrs. Abernathy's apartment was neat and compact, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Photographs, knickknacks, books lining the walls. She set her shopping bag in the kitchen and gestured for them to sit on a floral-patterned couch. "Let me get my tea and we'll talk," she said, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age. While she busied herself in the kitchen, James took in the surroundings, trying to imagine his mother visiting this apartment, perhaps sitting on this very couch. "We never expected to find someone who knew her," Matthew said quietly. "Statistical improbability," James agreed. "But here we are." Mrs. Abernathy returned with a tray holding a teapot and 3 cups. As she poured, her hands were steady despite their visible arthritis. "So," she said once they each had a cup, "you boys want to know about Sarah?" It wasn't a question, but they both nodded anyway. "She moved in when she was about 20, I think." "Already had you," she nodded to James. "Tiny little thing you were, always serious, even as a toddler." James tried to reconcile this description with his almost non-existent memories of that time. "She worked at the hospital," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "Some kind of administrative job. I used to watch you sometimes when her shifts ran long." She smiled faintly. "You love story time. Could sit for hours if someone was reading to you." The revelation of this small detail, that he had loved books as a child, hit James with unexpected force. It was such a simple thing, yet it connected him to a past he'd thought irretrievably lost. "Was she happy?" Matthew asked hesitantly. Mrs. Abernathy considered the question. "She had a hard life. No family support that I ever saw. The baby's father, your father," she amended, looking at James, "was long gone before I met her. But she had determination. She was taking night classes at the community college, trying to become a nurse. Said she wanted to give you a better life." She took a sip of her tea before continuing. "When she got pregnant again, she was scared but resolute. Said this baby deserved the same chance as his brother." She looked at Matthew. "That would be you, I suppose." Matthew nodded, his expression a mixture of pain and wonder. "I didn't see much of her after you were born," Mrs. Abernathy told Matthew. "She was in and out of the hospital. Heart problems, she said. Then one day social services came and took both children. A few weeks later, I heard she had passed." "Did she have any friends?" James asked. "Anyone else who might remember her?" "There was a young woman who visited sometimes. Another nurse, I think. Lisa or Lena, something like that." Mrs. Abernathy frowned in concentration. "And she mentioned grandparents occasionally. But from what I gathered, there had been some kind of falling out." "Do you know what about?" Matthew pressed gently. "Having children so young, out of wedlock. Different times back then." Mrs. Abernathy sighed. "Such a waste. Families should stick together, especially in hard times." James and Matthew exchanged a glance, the irony of her statement not lost on either of them. "Wait here," Mrs. Abernathy said suddenly, setting down her teacup. "I just remembered something." She disappeared into what appeared to be a bedroom, returning a few minutes later with a small cardboard box. "After Sarah died, the landlord cleared out her apartment. I asked if I could keep a few things in case her family ever came looking. She set the box on the coffee table. No one ever did until now." With gnarled fingers, she removed the lid, revealing a small collection of items. A few paperback books, a ceramic mug with flowers painted on it, a knitted baby blanket in faded blue, and a small photo album. "These were hers?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Nothing valuable, just personal things." Matthew reached for the photo album with reverent care. "May we?" "That's why I kept them, young man. They belong to you boys now." Matthew opened the album, and James leaned closer to see. The first page showed their mother, younger than in the photos they had, standing in front of what looked like a high school. On the next page, she held an infant James, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fierce pride. Page after page revealed moments of a life they had never known. Sarah in a hospital uniform, Sarah pushing a toddler James on a swing, Sarah with a slightly rounded belly that must have been Matthew growing inside her. She took pictures of everything. Mrs. Abernathy commented, "Said she wanted you to have memories even if you were too young to remember yourself." The last pages of the album were empty. Future moments never captured, memories never made. James reached for the knitted blanket next, running his fingers over the soft yarn. Did she make this? No, that came from her mother, your grandmother. One of the few things she sent after you were born, Mrs. Abernathy explained. Sarah kept it even after their relationship soured. So our grandparents knew about us, Matthew said softly. They just chose not to take us in after she died. People make complicated choices, Mrs. Abernathy said diplomatically. Not always the right ones. They spent another hour with the elderly woman, examining each item in the box, asking questions about Sarah, absorbing every detail Mrs. Abernathy could remember. When they finally prepared to leave, she insisted they take the box with them. I've kept these things safe for over 30 years, she said. It's time they went home with Sarah's boys. In the car, the box secure on Matthew's lap, they sat in silence for several minutes. She was real, Matthew finally said. Not just a photo or a name on a death certificate. She had books she liked to read in a favorite coffee mug, and she was proud of us. James added, his voice rough with emotion. Both of us. The realization settled between them. They hadn't been abandoned or unwanted by their mother. She had fought to keep them, to build a life for them, until her body had betrayed her. We need to find our grandparents, Matthew said suddenly. They're probably still alive. We have names now, and Mrs. Abernathy said they lived in Oak Ridge County. James felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger at these unknown grandparents who had left them to the foster care system, but also a desperate curiosity. They were his only remaining blood relatives besides Matthew. Yes, he agreed. We do. As they drove away from the apartment building where their mother had lived and died, James felt something shift inside him, as if a door long closed had been forced open, letting in light that was both painful and necessary. They had come looking for facts and found something far more precious, evidence that they had been loved, that they had belonged to someone, that their existence had mattered to the young woman who had given them life. It wasn't enough, could never be enough to fill the void of 30+ years, but it was a beginning. The search for Robert and Elizabeth Callahan proved more complicated than they had anticipated. Initial online searches revealed multiple people with those names in the region, none of whom seemed to be the right age or location. We need more information, Matthew said a week later as they sat in his apartment, surrounded by printouts and notes. Maybe through Mom's death certificate we can access her birth certificate, which might have more details about her parents. James nodded, but his attention was on the photo album they had recovered from Mrs. Abernathy. He had been studying it every chance he got, memorizing his mother's face, searching for clues in the backgrounds of photos, trying to reconstruct a life from fragmentary evidence. There's something here, he said, pointing to a photo of Sarah in what appeared to be a backyard gathering. Look at the banner. Matthew leaned closer. In the background hung a faded banner reading, Happy Retirement, Robert. Could be our grandfather, Matthew agreed. But there's no date on the photo, and we can't see who the banner's for. James flipped to the next page, then the next, searching for more images from the same event. Here, he said triumphantly. The photo showed Sarah standing beside an older couple. The man gray-haired and solid, the woman petite with Sarah's same delicate features. That has to be them, Matthew breathed. Our grandparents. The photo had been taken from a distance, making it difficult to see details clearly, but it was the first image they had of the people who might still be their living relatives. There's writing on the back of some of these, James realized, carefully removing the photo from its sleeve. He turned it over to find faded handwriting. Mom and Dad's backyard, Dad's retirement party. May 1982. 1982, Matthew repeated. That's 4 years before she died. They were still in contact then, which means the falling out Mrs. Abernathy mentioned happened after this. James concluded, possibly when she got pregnant with you. Matthew flinched slightly at the implication. So they knew about me and still didn't take us in after she died. James felt his brother's pain as if it were his own. We don't know the full story yet, he said, trying to be fair despite his own rising anger. There could be other factors. Like what? Matthew challenged. What possible justification could there be for abandoning your grandchildren to foster care? James had no answer. His military training had taught him to reserve judgment until all facts were known, but his instincts as a newly discovered brother made objectivity difficult. Let's keep looking, he said instead. The retirement party gives us a time frame. If our grandfather retired in 1982, he would have been in his 60s then, which would make him in his 90s now if he's still alive. The photo was taken in their backyard, Matthew pointed out. If we can figure out where they lived in 1982, property records, James said immediately. If we can find their address from that time, we might be able to trace forward to where they are now. They spent the next several days digging through public records, using the few clues they had to narrow their search. It was Matthew who finally found the breakthrough. "I think I've got something," he said, calling James at work. Robert Callahan retired from Westlake Manufacturing in 1982 after 30 years of service. There was a notice in the local paper with a photo. "It's definitely the same man from the album. Any mention of where they lived?" James asked, stepping away from the boiler he'd been repairing. "Better." The article mentioned he and his wife Elizabeth were planning to enjoy retirement in their Oak Ridge County home. I cross-referenced property records and found a Robert and Elizabeth Callahan, who owned a house on Willow Lane from 1965 to 2010. 2010? What happened then? The property was sold. I'm still working on tracking where they went after that. James felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Good work. I'll be off in a couple of hours. We can figure out next steps then. By the time James arrived at Matthew's apartment that evening, his brother had compiled an impressive amount of information. After they sold the house in 2010, I found records of them purchasing a condo in Sunset Palms retirement community, Matthew explained, showing James the documents he'd found. And here's the best part. I called the community under the pretense of wanting to send a card to an old family friend, and the receptionist confirmed that Robert Callahan still lives there. Still lives there, James repeated. Present tense? Matthew nodded. Apparently our grandfather is alive and well at 94. And our grandmother? No mention. Given her age, she may have passed away. James sat down heavily on Matthew's couch, trying to process this information. Their grandfather, their mother's father, was alive and living less than an hour away. What do we do with this? He asked, looking up at Matthew. We go see him, Matthew said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Tomorrow. I already cleared my schedule. James hesitated. Shouldn't we call first? Or right? Just showing up might be shocking? Disruptive? Matthew's voice had an edge James hadn't heard before. Good. He deserves to be shocked after what he did. Matthew, James began cautiously. I understand you're angry. I am too. But we need to be strategic about this. If we go in confrontational, we might not get the answers we're looking for. Matthew paced the small living room. You don't understand. All my life I thought I had no one, that no one wanted me. And now I find out there was family out there who knew I existed and chose to let me disappear into the system. I do understand, James said quietly. I live the same reality. Matthew stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. I know. I'm sorry. He ran a hand through his hair. It's just, we're so close to answers. And we'll get them, James assured him. But let's do this right. Let's call first, say we're Sarah's sons and we'd like to meet him. Give him a chance to prepare. After a moment's consideration, Matthew nodded. You're right. Tactical approach. James smiled faintly at the military terminology. Exactly. We'll reconnoiter before engaging. The joke, small as it was, broke the tension. Matthew sat down beside him. Tomorrow then. We'll call in the morning and hopefully meet him in the afternoon. Tomorrow, James agreed, though his stomach knotted at the thought. That night, alone in his apartment, James found himself unable to sleep. He kept thinking about the grandfather he had never known, wondering what kind of man would allow his grandchildren to be separated and sent into foster care. He also thought about his mother, young, determined, ultimately defeated by her own body. Had she known what would happen to her sons after her death? Had she worried about their fate in her final moments? The questions haunted him until dawn broke, pale light creeping across his bedroom ceiling. By the time his alarm went off, he had been awake for hours, mentally preparing himself for what the day might bring. Matthew arrived at 8, looking as if he'd slept no better than James. They sat at James's kitchen table, staring at the phone between them. Ready? Matthew asked. James nodded. As I'll ever be. Matthew dialed the number for Sunset Palms, and after a brief conversation with the receptionist, was connected to Robert Callahan's unit. Hello? A man's voice, thin with age but clear, answered after several rings. Mr. Callahan, Matthew said, his own voice steady despite the tension James could see in his shoulders. My name is Matthew Collins. I'm calling because I'm Sarah Mitchell's son. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. So long that James wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, the elderly voice spoke again. Sarah's boy? Which one? The question sent a jolt through both of them. He knew there were two. The younger one, Matthew answered. I was just a baby when she died. My brother James is here with me. We recently found each other and have been trying to learn more about our mother. Another lengthy pause. How did you find me? It's a long story, Matthew said. We'd like to tell you in person if that's possible. Could we come visit you today? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken histories. Yes, Robert finally said. I suppose it's time. Come at 2 o'clock. The receptionist can direct you to my apartment. Thank you, Matthew said. We'll see you then. After he hung up, the brothers sat in stunned silence for several moments. He knew about both of us, James said finally, and he didn't sound surprised to hear from us. Almost like he's been expecting this call for years, Matthew agreed. The hours until their meeting stretched interminably. They tried to distract themselves by reviewing what they knew, preparing questions, even looking at the photo album again, but nothing could fully occupy their minds. At 1 o'clock, they got into Matthew's car and drove to Sunset Palms, a sprawling complex of low-rise buildings surrounded by carefully maintained gardens. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 50s, checked their IDs and directed them to Building C, Apartment 114. Mr. Callahan doesn't get many visitors, she commented as she signed them in. This will be a nice surprise for him. If only she knew, James thought. They walked through the manicured grounds in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Building C was painted a soft yellow with wide hallways and handrails along the walls. Apartment 114 had a small wreath on the door and a welcome mat that looked new. Ready? James asked, echoing Matthew's earlier question. Matthew nodded and James knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal an elderly man who bore a striking resemblance to the figure in the photo album, though considerably more aged. Robert Callahan stood straight despite his years, with a full head of white hair and the same square jaw that James recognized from his own mirror. Come in, he said simply, stepping back to allow them entry. The apartment was small but comfortable, filled with furniture that looked like it had come from a larger home. Photos lined the walls and shelves. None, James noted immediately, of Sarah or her children. Sit down. Robert gestured to a sofa while lowering himself carefully into a recliner. Would you like something to drink? I have water, juice, coffee. We're fine, thank you. Matthew answered for both of them. An awkward silence descended. Robert studied them openly, his eyes, the same hazel as Matthew's, moving from one to the other. You look like her, he finally said. Both of you in different ways. James has her chin. Matthew, you have her eyes. The casual use of their names, the easy identification of which was which, the comfortable acknowledgement of their resemblance to their mother, all of it felt surreal to James. You knew about us, he said, the words coming out more accusatory than he'd intended. Robert didn't flinch. Yes, I knew about you both. Then why? Matthew began, but Robert held up a hand. I imagine you have many questions, accusations too, and probably rightfully so. He sighed deeply. Before we get into all that, I want to show you something. He rose slowly and crossed to a cabinet, removing a leather-bound book similar to the photo album they had found. He returned to his seat and opened it carefully. Your grandmother made this, he said, turning the book to show them. One for each of you, actually. She kept adding to them until she died 10 years ago. James and Matthew leaned forward to see pages filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. Looking closer, James realized with shock that they were about him, his high school graduation announcement from the local paper of the town where he'd been fostered, a small article about his unit deploying to Afghanistan, even a mention of a commendation he'd received. Matthew's book, which Robert showed them next, contained similar documentation of his life, academic achievements, a feature on a design competition he had won in college, a photo that must have been taken surreptitiously at his community college graduation. You tracked us, Matthew said, his voice a mixture of wonder and anger. All these years you knew exactly where we were, what we were doing. Elizabeth tracked you, Robert corrected gently. Your grandmother never gave up on either of you. She couldn't bring herself to make contact, but she couldn't let you go completely either. Why? James demanded, his composure cracking. Why track us if you weren't going to be part of our lives? Why let us grow up thinking we had no family? Robert closed his eyes briefly, pain etching deeper lines into his already weathered face. When he opened them again, they were damp with unshed tears. Because I forbade it, he said simply. And it was the greatest mistake of my life. The admission hung in the air between them, both expected and shocking in its directness. When Sarah got pregnant with you, he looked at James. She was 19. College freshman, her whole future ahead of her. Your father was a graduate student who wanted nothing to do with a baby. I was furious, not at Sarah, though God forgive me, I let her think I was. I was furious at the situation, at the boy who'd abandoned her, at the unfairness of it all. He paused, collecting himself. But we adjusted. Elizabeth and I helped her finish her associate's degree. We babysat you, James, while she worked and studied. Things were strained but functioning. Well, Mom, what changed? Matthew asked. When she got pregnant with you, Matthew, it was like watching history repeat itself. Another man who wouldn't take responsibility. Another obstacle to the life we'd wanted for her. I said things. He shook his head. Terrible things I can never take back. Gave her an ultimatum. Give the baby up for adoption or lose our support. But she kept me. Matthew said softly. She was braver than I ever was. Robert acknowledged. She moved out, cut contact. We knew where she was living, but she wouldn't respond to calls or letters. Elizabeth would leave things on her doorstep, baby clothes, money, but we never saw her. And after she died, James pressed. Why didn't you take us in then? Robert's hands trembled slightly. By the time we learned of her death, you had already been placed in emergency foster care. I wanted to let the system handle it. Elizabeth wanted to fight for custody. We argued horribly. He swallowed hard. I convinced her that at our age, raising two young boys would be impossible. That you would be better off with younger parents who could give you the life you deserved. That wasn't your decision to make, Matthew said, anger evident in his voice. No, Robert agreed quietly. It wasn't. I was wrong. By the time I realized how wrong, years had passed. You were settled in your foster homes. Elizabeth had started her secret project of tracking you, keeping those books. He gestured to the albums. I told myself it was too late to disrupt your lives again. So you just watched us from a distance? James said, trying to keep the bitterness from his tone. While we grew up thinking we were alone in the world. Yes. Robert didn't try to justify it further. I have no excuse that would satisfy either of you. Only deep, abiding regret. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of decades of separation pressing down on all of them. Did you know we were placed in different homes? Matthew finally asked. That we grew up not knowing the other existed? Pain flashed across Robert's face. Not initially. By the time Elizabeth discovered that, you had been in separate placements for over a year. The system, he shook his head. The system failed you both. And we failed you by not fighting it. James felt the anger he'd been nurturing begin to fracture, giving way to something more complicated. This old man had made terrible choices that had shaped both their lives irreversibly. Yet the regret in his eyes was unmistakably genuine. Our mother, James said, changing direction. Tell us about her. Who was she, really? For the first time, a smile touched Robert's lips. Sarah was extraordinary. Stubborn as the day is long. Brilliant with numbers. Loved music. Couldn't carry a tune herself, but always had the radio on. And loyal. Fiercely loyal to those she loved. Including us, Matthew said. Especially you two, Robert confirmed. You boys were her world. Everything she did, working extra shifts, taking night classes, was to give you a better life than she'd had. Did she know she had a heart condition? James asked. Robert nodded slowly. The doctors warned her during her pregnancy with Matthew that there were signs of strain on her heart, but she refused to consider termination. Said she would rather die bringing him into the world than live knowing she had chosen otherwise. Matthew made a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. James reached over instinctively, gripping his brother's shoulder. She loved you both more than her own life. Robert continued, that's what makes my actions afterwards so unforgivable. I dishonored her memory and her sacrifice by allowing her sons to be separated. Why are you telling us this now? James asked. You could have denied knowing anything when Matthew called. Because I'm 94 years old, Robert said simply. I don't have much time left to make amends. And because Elizabeth made me promise, before she died, that if either of you ever found me, I would tell you everything and give you these. He reached into a drawer in the side table and removed 2 envelopes, yellowed with age, each bearing a name in elegant handwriting. Your grandmother wrote these letters years ago, updated them periodically. She wanted you to have them if we ever had the chance to meet. James took the envelope with his name on it, the paper light in his hands but somehow carrying the weight of decades of unspoken words. I don't expect forgiveness, Robert continued. I don't deserve it, But I want you to know that not a day has passed that Elizabeth and I didn't think of you, worry about you, feel pride in your accomplishments from afar. We loved you as best we could, which wasn't nearly enough. James looked at Matthew, seeing his own tumultuous emotions reflected in his brother's face. Anger, confusion, grief, and underneath it all, a desperate longing for connection that had defined both their lives. "I need some air," Matthew said abruptly, standing. "Of course." Robert nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." Matthew walked quickly to the door, James following close behind. Outside in the hallway, Matthew leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. "You okay?" James asked, though it was clearly a redundant question. "Not remotely," Matthew replied. "You?" "Same." They stood in silence for a moment, letters in hand, the past and present colliding in ways neither had been prepared for. "She chose me," Matthew said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew the risks, and she chose to have me anyway." "She loved you," James said simply. Both of us. And they tracked us. All those years they knew exactly where we were, what we were doing. They could have reached out at any time. James nodded, his own anger resurging. "I know, but they didn't," Matthew continued, "because of his pride, his stubbornness. An old man's inability to admit he was wrong." "Yes," Matthew straightened from the wall. "I want to hate him for that." "But," James prompted, sensing the unspoken continuation. "But he's our only living link to her, to our history." Matthew looked down at the envelope in his hand. "And he's 94. How much time do we have to stay angry before there's no one left to answer our questions?" The pragmatic assessment was so similar to James's own thoughts that he felt a renewed surge of connection to this brother he was still getting to know. Same blood, similar minds, even without shared upbringing. What do you want to do?" James asked. Matthew took a deep breath. "Go back in, hear him out, ask our questions. Maybe not forgive today, but leave the door open to the possibility." James nodded. "Agreed." They returned to the apartment to find Robert still sitting in his recliner, looking older and more vulnerable than he had when they'd arrived. "We have questions," Matthew said as they sat back down. "A lifetime of them. I'll answer everything I can," Robert promised. For the next 3 hours they talked. About Sarah, her childhood, her dreams, her struggles. About Elizabeth, her secret campaign to keep track of her grandsons. Her yearly ritual of baking cakes on their birthdays that no one would eat. Her regrets that haunted her until her death. About the family medical history they should know. The relatives they had never met. The grandparents and great-grandparents whose blood ran in their veins. As afternoon faded into evening, James found his anger gradually transforming into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Robert Callahan was a flawed man who had made a catastrophic error in judgment that had shaped 3 generations. But he was also a grieving father who had lost his only child, a widower living with decades of regret, and the only person alive who could fill in the blank spaces of their history. "It's getting late," Robert noted as the room darkened around them. "You boys should probably get going. But would you consider coming back sometime?" The question hung in the air, weighted with hope and uncertainty. James looked at Matthew, who gave a small nod. "Yes," James answered for both of them. "We'll come back." Relief washed over Robert's weathered face. "Thank you," he said simply. As they prepared to leave, Robert reached for a small photo album on the coffee table. "Take this with you," he said. "It's copies of pictures of Sarah growing up. Elizabeth put it together for you. Just in case. Just in case we ever found you," James completed mentally. "Just in case you found the courage to make amends before it was too late." Matthew accepted the album with careful hands. "Thank you." At the door, Robert hesitated, then asked, Would it be presumptuous to ask to shake your hands?" The request, so formal and tentative, spoke volumes about the man's awareness of his own failings. James extended his hand first, feeling the paper-thin skin and fragile bones of the elderly man who was his grandfather. "Goodbye for now, Mr. Callahan," he said, not quite ready to use a more familiar term. "Robert, please," the old man requested. Well, perhaps someday you might call me grandfather. If I earn that right." The vulnerability in the statement touched something in James he hadn't expected to feel. Empathy for this man who had caused them so much pain, yet was now reaching across decades of separation with trembling hands. "We'll see you soon, Robert," Matthew said, also shaking the old man's hand. Outside in the gathering dusk, they walked slowly to the car, each lost in thought. the letters and photo album clutched in their hands. "What now?" Matthew asked as they got in. James looked down at the envelope bearing his name. "Now we read these letters. And then, I don't know. We figure it out as we go, I guess." "Together?" Matthew added. "Together," James agreed. They drove back to the city in thoughtful silence, the weight of the past settling around them, not like a burden now, but like puzzle pieces finally fitting into place, revealing a picture that was painful and beautiful and complex, but most importantly, complete. The letters from Elizabeth Callahan were everything they could have hoped for and more. Detailed accounts of their mother's life, explanations for the family's fractured relationships, expressions of love and regret that spanned decades. She had updated them periodically, the handwriting becoming shakier in the later editions, but the sentiment remaining constant. "We loved you. We failed you. We never stopped thinking of you." In the weeks that followed their meeting with Robert, James and Matthew visited him regularly. Sometimes the conversations were difficult, reopening old wounds. Other times they were healing, filling in blanks that had haunted both brothers for years. They learned that their mother had been artistic, that she had played soccer in high school, that she had dreamed of becoming a nurse practitioner specializing in pediatrics. They discovered that James had her determination, her seriousness, her protective instincts. Matthew had her creativity, her expressive eyes, her quick laugh. They also learned about themselves, that they shared more than DNA. Both were stubborn, both valued honesty above politeness, both had the same unexpected sense of humor that emerged in moments of stress. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, they began to forge something neither had experienced before, a family bound by choice as well as blood. 6 months after the fire that had first brought them together, James found himself hosting a small gathering in his apartment. Matthew, Robert, and several friends from the Veterans Support Group, including Dr. Powell, Walter, and Elena. "A toast," Walter proposed, raising his glass. "To family found." "To family found," the group echoed. Later, as the gathering wound down, James stood on his small balcony, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk descended. Matthew joined him, leaning against the railing. "Putty penny for your thoughts," Matthew said. James smiled faintly. "Just thinking about how different my life is from 6 months ago." "How different I am? Better different or worse different?" "Definitely better." James turned to look at his brother, the word no longer feeling foreign or uncomfortable. "I spent 15 years in the Army searching for purpose, for belonging. Never expected to find it in a fire in my own building." Matthew nodded, understanding. "I used to have this recurring dream," he admitted, "that someone was looking for me, that somewhere out there, a person existed who would recognize me, claim me as their own." He shook his head. "Turns out that person was living across the hall." Life has a twisted sense of humor. James quoted Matthew's words from months earlier. "Indeed it does." From inside the apartment came the sound of laughter. Robert telling one of his stories about Sarah's childhood antics, the veterans responding with appreciation. "We should go back in," Matthew suggested. "Make sure Grandpa isn't exaggerating too much." The term Grandpa had emerged gradually as their relationship with Robert evolved from strained to cautiously affectionate. The old man had wept the first time Matthew had used it. "In a minute," James said. "I wanted to tell you something first." Matthew turned to him expectantly. "I'm leaving the maintenance job," James announced. "The VA has a program for veterans who want to become emergency medical technicians. I start training next month." Matthew's face broke into a wide smile. "James, that's perfect for you." "Dr. Shumash," Powell suggested it. "Said I have the temperament and experience for emergency response." And after the fire, he shrugged. "I realized I'm still good in a crisis. Still need to be useful that way." "You'll be excellent at it," Matthew assured him. "Running toward danger instead of away from it is kind of your thing." James laughed softly. Apparently so. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city settle into evening. "Thank you," James said suddenly. "For what? For calling me that night. For having dinner with me after. For pushing to find our history when I was reluctant." James met his brother's eyes. "For being stubborn enough to build this, whatever this is. Family, I guess." Matthew's expression softened. "You did the hard part long before I came along." "Well, what's that?" "You ran into the fire," Matthew said simply. Everything else followed from that one choice. Inside, someone called their names. Robert, wanting to show them another photo he'd brought. Coming, Matthew called back. He turned to James. Ready to go in? James looked at his brother, this person who had been a stranger 8 months ago and was now essential to his life, and felt a sense of completion he had never expected to experience. Ready, he confirmed. Together, they stepped back into the warmth of the apartment, back into the circle of people who had become, in different ways and to different degrees, their chosen family. In the center sat Robert, their link to the past they had lost and reclaimed. As James settled into a chair beside him, the elderly man reached over and patted his hand. A gesture so simple, yet so profound in its familial intimacy that James felt his throat tighten with emotion. I was just telling everyone about your mother's high school graduation, Robert said. How proud we were that day. Tell us, Matthew encouraged, sitting on the floor near Robert's feet, looking for all the world like a child at story time. And as Robert began to speak, painting pictures of a past they had never known but that had shaped them nonetheless, James realized that the fire had done more than bring him face to face with an unknown brother. It had also brought him face to face with himself. The parts he had walled off, the connections he had avoided, the life he had put on hold. In saving Matthew, he had inadvertently saved himself. The ex-soldier had saved his neighbor from a fire, later discovering the man he rescued was the brother he never met. But the story didn't end there. It had only just begun. A story of reconnection, of healing, of family found and forged in the most unexpected of circumstances. A story still being written, one day at a time,